a topic that is unironically very close to my heart. Something that once I realized it was just movie fantasy, as probably a 5 year old boy, I became outraged to find that dueling had been made illegal, and all of those fantasies and historical books that I had read of epic duels being used to solve disputes. And indeed, at our school, as young whippersnappers, we used to just beat each other up if there was a dispute, and then we would all be friends afterwards, but I would get to be the goalkeeper this time. How are you doing today? We are joined with our good friend Rupert August here to give us some reasons why we should be legalizing dueling.
Hello, everyone. Well, just as a first quick history point, funnily enough, some of what we associate with the high point of dueling did actually occur when it was already illegal. So it's not something that couldn't make a comeback without the law having changed. But
Yes, I'm
yeah, a lot of
inspired.
things.
5 figures, and we can create a live stream Coliseum event that will push us into this new opt in dueling culture that will bring back the reign of the masculine man.
Well, some of the stuff that we're probably going to get into is going to talk about how the mindset needs to change a little bit. It's not just about creating a platform for people to carry out this activity, but it's also just about encouraging the kind of mindsets that draw people into wanting to duel. So the big thing is a respect for honor and a respect for one's own kind of good name, and to see that slandered is something that somebody would have to consider to be worse than death in some cases.
Yeah, there has to be a pressure to it. This is why I have it as well. I kind of have like a legal framework that you could uh, move into first. Unless there's any big points you want to make, I can lay out how I would force people legally to be be honorful. What's the word for honorful? Full of
On
honor?
on about
Honor bound. Yes, well, yeah, just true and
uh,
knightly and chivalrous. Perhaps that's what I'm looking for.
sure, yeah.
But
But yes, this is more your topic, so please go ahead.
oh, delightful! Here we go, legalizing dueling. Here's how we can do it, Monty. Okay, so we have an opt-in dueling culture. This dueling culture allows you to sign up to a register. That means you can duel anyone else who is also in on the register. So it's like an opt-in thing, right? So, seeing as let's imagine I'm some shadowy oligarchy whose sole goal is to actually preserve the warrior spirit and warrior genes, basically, of humanity and not have civilization breed out all of our good fighters, our traditional martial European spirit is not just going to be replaced with, wow, GDP growing office culture. Can't wait to get some more of that, right? No nonsense. We can go back to the days of the Colosseum and it can be libertarian proof. It's all about consent. Opt in. I consent to fight you. I consent to risk this in this duel, or I will use this duel as a league, what do you call it? A dispute settling. Oh, what dispute settling mechanism? Yes, we can go with that one. You could duel for pink slips on your sick modified ride, or you could duel for land, for titles, whatever it is. Obviously, this would take a long time to develop, and it's very end game heavy as this sort of system. But very simply, you have the League of Duelists, let's call it, this dueling register, where people who are in that league can duel other people who are in the league, and they must accept the challenge of the duel and fight either to. Now, obviously, historical point, duels aren't typically to the death unless they are like high stakes things. They go until mercy, they go until incapacitation, or like we did at high school, until he falls on the floor and you can call yourself the winner and he's not getting back up, he's crying for his mummy. or beefing his fucking eyes out, mate, in other terms. But with this opt-in dueling culture, you would be it would create sort of a separate, more masculine class and sort of a bragging rights to it. But also, I'm undecided whether I would allow this system initially or whatever. But there is a place for people who sign up for the dueling culture, the League of Duelists, right? To fight in the place of people who are not on the register so they can accept challenges as champions. And obviously, the focus for this is to build a warrior class, is to build a place for the masculine martial human. The masculine, well, obviously you'd have female fighters too, but come on, let's be serious. About 90 to 95% of the people who would sign up for this would be very stereotypical Roman legionnaires and Celtic wild men types who'd be signing up for this, as well as, raiding barbarians of all different peoples over history and time. And indeed, it would be like MMA, but much more interesting, because within the dueling culture, there should be no limitations on anything outside of what a man can wield by himself. Now, we can change the parameters of this, and people can duel in tanks if they wanted to, but we also want to have a system where 5 duelists can fight against a team of another 5 duelists if they consent to it. And obviously, you will have disputes coming up, and perhaps you would need. Obviously, there's no need for anything like a referee or poor sport for someone to stop early. The whole point of this is to be above the sporterized system, to mimic combat and the omnipresent force of violence that, well, usually the state has a monopoly on, but this is kind of like the deterrent against well, not completely, but kind of think of it as, the Second Amendment allows people to be armed in order to resist tyrannical governments. Well, if your population is full up of different factions of warriors who have duelists and so forth, I think it would promote more of that, not only self-pride, but self-sufficiency, a decentralized power structure that accepts not just a monopolized state presence of violence, but, a polite society is an armed society, they say. But yeah, that's how I think without having to bring in chivalry and honor culture, which is long since dead, with the mainstream of population, right? And people don't want to watch acts of chivalry and admire them en masse. There's a few people that are into that kind of stuff these days, but it's few and far between. I think this would allow not only a massive economic thing behind it, because people are going to want to watch this online. They're going to be gambling on it legally or illegally. Obviously can't do it here because it's illegal to do that in this country that I'm in, but I'm totally up for setting up the Bangkok Coliseum and getting this stuff rolling. What do you think, Rupert?
So there's a few different points that I would like to pick up on. In no particular order, the idea of not having any referees doesn't appeal to me. Traditionally, I think both sides brought their own sort of referee, and it was as much to kind of protect I suppose keep everything a bit contained in a certain sense, and just to keep an eye on everything, because one thing that is important is that if you've agreed that you're going to duel to first blood, and then you try and yield, and he continues to try and kill you, then you've got a problem if no one's able to step in and stop that.
That is a big problem. I agree. I'm happy to walk this back. This is just a network. As long as we get dueling legalized, the shadowy duelist oligarchy will be pleased. What another
Of course.
blow another hole in the battleship, sir.
Well, no, it's more just a thought and an expansion, because one of the things that I've been thinking and talking about is how do you create and filter your aristocracy? Because it would be my contention, as per elite theory, that there always exists an aristocracy within a society, which is to say, a rule by the best, but the question is the best at what? And so if
Yeah,
you have
I
things like
understand. Yeah. Like a
yeah,
best
and so
at,
if
like currently in our system, it's the best at amassing power or blackmail intel on the opposition, right?
right, yes, stuff like that, or being a general merchant salesman type person, that's very heavily rewarded in our current system.
Yes.
So how do you get back to promoting other kinds of virtues which are perhaps being sidelined at the moment, which have traditionally been rewarded by the European aristocracy, for example, or preserved at least in the European aristocracy? There was much more of a um, martial focus there, and even though you might think that spending all the time, sitting on laurels with no major European war over the course of the 19th century leading into World War One, you would think it would have died out a little bit, become a little bit decadent, but you'd be surprised at the conduct of. So I don't know about other countries' officers who perhaps also had an aristocratic tradition, but at least in the UK, we very much maintained that strong martial culture. Um, Unfortunately, a lot of those men paid quite dearly for maintaining that, because it meant that they were, acting with the kind of gallantry that they were expecting their men to emulate. And yeah, World War One was just a bit of a brutal place for that kind of thing. But it carried over into World War Two, and I'm told even to the modern day to a certain extent. It's just been watered down as the aristocracy has been kind of slowly filtered out of the officer corps. So how do you get that kind of that martial reward back? And I think the idea that you suggested, which is something I admittedly hadn't thought of actually, of dueling for things other than honor. So I just associate it with purely dueling for prestige and honor, which I also don't think is something that would necessarily have to go away entirely, because you can even see that some of that kind of thing in the YouTube sphere of all places, where you have gossip and drama happening, but then people are they want to get out, and even if it sometimes means confronting the person who's accusing them directly on something like a drama alert, you still have that kind of want to protect one's own, in one day we might call it brand, but their honor and their good name.
Yeah, old, famous, schizophrenically typed out lines of mine. Debate or duel me, FGT. Debate or duel me.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in that framework, a debate is just a form of more limited duel. But
100%, yeah. It's
yeah,
the duel of ideas. It's it's horrible, and very often the debate format is actually who can wreck the opposition and entertain the audience more than the other side. But that, for me, personally, I've always thought that's what debate has been like. But it's supposed to be an intellectually honors based thing. I think one of the great things about dueling is you can't get away with that. It's just like combat sports, really. You can't pull snaky. Of course, there's things like doping and stuff. Blood doping and enhancing performance enhancers, etc. But when it comes to dueling and fighting and stuff like that, really, I mean, come on, everybody just does it anyway, so why does it have to be such a consideration? But I thought it was funny because you straight away see the validity of fighting for honor, and I do personally as well. If you pissed me off, and I could foolishly or victoriously beat you or get shot in a duel over it and resolve it that way. I'd prefer that over a legal situation almost all of the time, having watched people go through legal battles that last years and years and draw out all this energy and whatnot. It might have been better to just have one of my ears or eyes taken off. But the reason why I insist that you kind of have to add in that you can win anything, you can put up anything, like almost like a gamble in a duel, is because, well, it's a dice roll, it's a card draw, it adds that level of chance and brutality to things, but it keeps the capitalist interested. It keeps big finance. It keeps tech that would have to broadcast this stuff. Not current neoliberal tech, of course, but there's a lot to it if it can do anything. It becomes like, well, did you speak to him? And like, no, and then naturally it could reach to a point where people just know that the next level, rather than some ridiculous and usually finance-driven thing where they go to a court and the truth has to be proved by whoever's got the best lawyer and evidence compared together, right? If you could go trial
Well,
by
that's
combat, you'd come on, it offers a lot more equality for well, at least for the marshal.
yeah. So that's one of the things that I was going to pick up on is there's a criticism. Well, one of the main criticisms that could be leveled, especially if we're talking about this in the framework of honor, is, or someone's been slandered. How are you going to find out what the truth of the matter is? So currently, as you said, our mechanism for doing that would be, let's go through a court battle and we'll decide if you slandered me or not. Whereas in this kind of framework, you could skip that and just go straight to a duel instead, if both parties consent.
Yeah.
And the criticism could be leveled that this is effectively determining truth, the truth of the matter by who is most brawny, or who is most martially capable.
That's correct. But the issue there is it's all about the mutual consent. One party could ask to duel the other, and if they're signed up to this register, they are compelled to say yes. Otherwise, they lose their position on the register, and we can think up all sorts of punishments or fines or whatever happens with this. And then there's the social taboo of being an absolute pussy as well. But the point would be that situation cannot occur unless both sides of the duel agree within this system.
Right. But the other thing to mention is what are we comparing that against? Because as you said, court battles quite often turn into a factor of who's got more money, who can throw more resources at this problem in order to have it seen resolved in their favor.
Yeah,
Whereas
I agree.
that is not.
I agree.
That is not hitting the truth either.
It'd just be something to add on top of it. That'd be my argument against it. If it's consensual and costs less resources, it's outside the premises of the state. Or if the state is smart, they would make a nationalised coliseum and see this off at the head. And I'd be all up for, well, what should we call it? Ministry of Dueling Affairs? I don't know.
Ministry of Conflict Resolution?
Yeah, I mean, let's just call it the Bangkok Coliseum, and it'll work for the rest of the world. Everybody can fly on over. They already fly to Phuket and Bangkok to get their fancy Joe Rogan approved MMA camps and whatever, and do DMT with the guy who pretends he's a South American shaman, but really he's just a drug addict from Barbados. That's a story for another time. But have you got any... okay, so I got one more point, and then I'll let you rattle off another one if you have some. We've got... for me personally, I mentioned and touched on this personally earlier. If we breed out our warrior genes and our fighting spirits, then who would take the place of fighting against tyranny? Because, I mean, look back in history. It's actually like a natural human cycle that we go through an extremely decadent period where the people who run at the top are like these Babylonian and strange Baal and Moloch worshipping peoples who have, laid these debt web traps over us and our future generations to punish us for the ideas of Central European idealism plus, the way that they got kicked out. These, practitioners got kicked out over and over again for their malpractice, right? And if we now move into a society where we do not allow any form of controlled combat outside of approved war in the Middle East / policeman has authority to do this or that, and I mean in places like in Europe, Western Europe, Central, Northern Europe, and even Southern Europe in some places, right? The police are not allowed to, mete out this. They're supposed to subdue a bit more than they do in the US. They're allowed to crush a bit heavier in certain circumstances in the US, especially now with the protests. They seem to have had enough. They just bring in the National Guard pretty much by default now. But anyway, the point would be that if we are going to go into late stage capitalism, perhaps post scarcity or very sudden lack of resources, who knows which way it's going to go in the next 5 years or so. if we're going to go into that, and we're not going to have within our peoples, within the human race as a whole, a warrior spirit that is catered to, and we are just going to keep breeding these SSRI and surgery modern medicine and modern psychiatry, and there's all sorts of poisons and cultural malaise that holds or that lays over modern society. If we're not going to have our warrior genes and fighting spirits, two things: how are we going to fight the tyrants off, and what will we do in the case of a physical alien invasion, or some kind of, if we, okay, so the alien invasion thing is only half serious, right? But it is tangible that at some point humanity might have to fight not only itself once it's expanded out across the galaxy, right? Or locally, if we get to that point, right? But if it does ever have to come up against another species, well, there's all sorts of far-fetched and kind of realistic xenomorph scenarios that could play out. And if we go there and all we have is, hi, I like growing my GDP by having a large population of underclass in a highly stratified economy, would you like to trade? And they have no reason or no need for our resources. Come on, this is not how you keep an animal able to defend itself, so to speak.
Yeah, I suppose the issue there is that most civilizations have recognized the need to have some kind of defense, and so usually the way that this plays out is that the defense is outsourced to a different entity. So this happened and has happened multiple times in the Arabic world, where first they outsourced the army duties basically to the Turks, and then so yes, it's those Turks that now inhabit Turkey. You can kind of see how that went, and then they did the same for the Mamluks, who were Christian convert castrated slaves first that formed an army in Egypt, and then they just decided to take over the government and decided they didn't want to be castrated anymore, and that instead they just form a regular old dynasty, more or less, and like a ruling class. And
Do you know what?
Usually.
I don't want to have my balls cut off. I'm going to form a dynasty.
Funnily enough, the Janissaries came to the same conclusion. But yes, the trouble with doing it on a or considering this in a wider scale is that you can't. So there still has to be within this framework a place for the defense to go. The responsibility of defense, and so you could say that maybe we outsource it to technology entirely. At this point, that seems like the most likely scenario that would remove it from humanity. But otherwise, we would just be completely stratifying down some kind of lines that mean we have just some kind of warrior caste who is dedicated to the defense capabilities of all mankind. If we're looking at that kind of beyond Earth kind of scale.
Yeah,
but,
the Sardaukar from Dune, like the elite troops that come from a prison planet. Yeah, I mean, I'm not against something like that, but bringing it a bit more back to our current place in the timeline. This is kind of like something that would be very popular with veterans, I imagine, already.
With who, sorry?
With veterans, people who've done military service and whatnot, or I think, people, the kind of people that support compulsory military service are kind of like the people. I think they'd be up for this, allowing this kind of opt-in, I consent to doing this kind of culture. Almost, let's put it to them. Let's poll them. Crowdfund me a poll. Let's go see these veterans and see if they want to bring back battering people. But
I mean, as far as I know, a lot of veterans don't really they have a very very much like a civil perspective on violence. And when I say that, I mean civil in the sense of what current civilization thinks about violence and war, which is that it's extremely unpleasant and that we should avoid it at all costs. And veterans themselves seem to embrace that quite a lot of the time. I mean, they're a diverse bunch, of course, but from what I've seen, um, interviews and such, and the way that people have talked about it,
Yes, I
they wouldn't
agree.
want to
I
go back.
agree. I agree with everything from the modern period, i.e.,
Yeah,
stuff from World War One to World War Two, because of the nature of combat. There is that very civil spirit. However, I think with what we're describing here, because it could be blades, fists, or bullets, it's up to the people who are dueling to decide it, right? It's going to be small. Well, if you want to go at it and stand in a very large field and shoot at each other from a mile away with mortars and see who wins. I mean, that'd be a very inventive and possible duel if you had the space, right? But I imagine that most people would take up pistols, rapiers, fight to the death with our hands because we're two Celtic woodmen.
yeah. The place that I was going to go with that is that, I mean, maybe you could do it this way around, or the reverse, but basically that there would have to be, and would necessarily be I guess, an improvement in our perspective on war, in that we might start to see some kind of additional glory in it, and either that comes about because of the dueling, or it comes about, or that dueling is encouraged by this different perspective on violence and war. The idea that one can find honor and glory and perhaps even fulfillment from the act of violence.
Of course, yeah. I mean, the main reason that this appeals to me personally is because I've always felt like, well, as I explained earlier, growing up in high school, it was very normal for there to be fights that were not particularly nasty or savage fights, but they were reasonably common. And younger boys, obviously in primary school or younger school, elementary school, whatever you want to call it, as soon as someone went down and scraped their knee or whatever, or you punched him in the face because he bounced a football off the back of your head and his nose bust, and you were quite surprised that it worked. But hey ho, you won that one. This sort of stuff, it's cathartic. It fixes things. It provides a very definite resolution to the situation, and it doesn't have to necessarily involve enemy, long sustaining feuds and whatnot. But I'm not saying that wouldn't happen. But this is all supposed to be part of the show, right? I mean, if you have and I'm beginning to think much more that civilization is in the business of pressure release more than it's in the business of anything else, right? And I believe that if you had a dueling system, a coliseum that allowed not only community and an economy behind it, because you've got all the presenters, the people running the media, the people running the gambling. If you some people think gambling is I mean, if we're going with dueling, gambling consensually, it can't be illegal too, even though it is in quite a lot of countries. But okay, I digress. But the point would be that this would allow a pressure release valve that isn't war, that isn't going to the pub and looking for a fight whilst you are drunk and stuff like that. Obviously, it doesn't have to have the appeal to the average Joe, and it won't, because humans in history, they aren't all fighters. It calls to a certain person, and I don't think that would lead to a glorification of violence. But if it does, fuck it, mate. We'll probably do something like that. We've lived too decadently for too long. Let's hope it's not a World War III, and let's hope it's just a giant Colosseum conflict like the Olympics, but instead of just crappy little boxing matches, we can watch teams of 100 men fight it out battle royale style.
The only thing I would be a little skeptical of is the extent to which it's commodified and turned into a financial property. I wouldn't want that to happen for it, and the focus always be on. So sure, you could have a bunch of people making money from it because you film it, and you have a coliseum for it, as you say. But I would never want it to become just a purely commercial phenomenon where you have like celebrity, just you have celebrity fighters who just fight because they're paid to fight, and
Yeah,
that's it.
I agree, but my problem is that's not the world that I've ever seen, and the romance behind it and stuff like that. In our current age, with the way that humanity behaves, I mean, even before the ideas of capitalism and stuff like that, you could show someone a shiny gold coin and they'd throw a match for you. They'd do this or that, you know. So I kind of feel like, you know, adding the gambling, adding the commodification of it and such, I feel like it's just something that would have to happen in order for it to work. It's not something that I would want to happen, but I mean, come on, the world makes the money the world makes the money turn, and and the money makes the world turn, right? So it goes
Yeah.
both ways.
But I would. So one way that I could see of trying to make sure that there's some substance that remains to the cultural aspect rather than it just becoming a purely cynical money making phenomenon would be that you have to have some kind of external reason for entering into the duel. You can't just enter for any reason. You have to have some kind of dispute to resolve, and that be something that keeps away people who are just professional fighters who fight just because they're paid to.
Okay, well, next week, Clubsguard will be heading to Coup Parliament, and we will be tabling this one, and we'll be talking about if we are going to allow money and other commodifications of the dueling culture. Just before we go and check out the last rounds of artillery coming out of our militia den here in Malaysia, have you got any final parting statements? Our good friend Rupert August joining us here today. Take it away, Mr. Rupert.
Nothing much more to say. See you on the other side.
Cheerio.